Welcome to Enlightenment with Julian, your gateway to a journey of self-discovery and empowerment. In each episode, Julian delves into the essence of wisdom and self-esteem, offering insights and messages to inspire your growth. Now, here's your host, Julian, to guide you on this transformative journey towards living your best life.
Hello there. I'm very excited for today's episode. If you are a new listener, it's a pleasure to meet you. But if you are a returning listener, welcome back. Before I go any further with this episode, I like to point out that in the last episode, I launched a challenge for you to do. The challenge was to write to me a moment in your life that you've faced difficulty and how you overcame that obstacle. This is because when the challenge is over, I will dedicate an episode or two reading your stories. That way your voice could be heard and that people who are currently struggling can find someone that they can relate to, especially when those stories are shared. Now, I like to also add that your name will be kept confidential and anonymous, meaning that no one will know who wrote these stories except for me and me only. As much as I want to respect your stories from you, I also want to respect the privacy it entails when it comes to telling your story. Having your names omitted from the episode will keep that privacy in check and will also be able to shine a light to your story. In order to participate, you can DM me personally on Instagram at Enlightenment_pod or TikTok at the.enlightenment7. That way, I can copy and paste them into my notes, so that way I can start writing for the next script for the future episode. As for being aware and up to date with any new information that is currently going on with either the podcast or the episode itself, I will keep it posted on Instagram, so that way you all can be aware of the progress of the episode and finally know when the episode is released. As for where you can listen to the episode when it drops, you can find it on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. That way, you will be able to have access to not just the podcast, but its wonderful teachings it will offer you. Make sure you follow or subscribe wherever you are listening to this podcast. In today's episode, I will be talking about death. Now, I know I did say no more further delays, but I just want to quickly take the time to point out that before we dive into this episode, I want to dedicate it to my grandfather. Ironically enough, today, April 19th, is his birthday. He would have been 72 years old this year, but sadly he passed away from cancer back in 2017. I just found it coincidental that his birthday is the same day as the release date for this episode. However, I also found it as an opportunity, and I decided to make this episode as a tribute to him, with the topic of death being the main focus and subject of this episode. After all, I'm sure we all had a loss in our lives that impacted us tremendously, especially the loss of a loved one. And to my grandfather, if you are listening to this podcast somehow, I just want to say that me and Mom love you so much, and there is not one day that goes by without thinking about you. Happy birthday, Pop-Pop. Now, I also like to point out that there will be a bit of a trigger warning to those who are emotionally sensitive or uncomfortable to topics or mentions of things such as self-harm or suicide. And while these things are not graphic or gory descriptions, I understand the power of words can have on people. So, if you do not feel comfortable listening to this episode of my podcast, it is totally fine. I have other episodes where I don't mention those things and you can still enjoy listening not to just them, but to me. Just note that you don't have to listen to this episode if you don't feel comfortable with these topics. Now, I'm sure that we all know what the word death means and the concept of it. However, when discussing death, there's typically two ways that one can see it. The first is our fear of death. After all, we sometimes fear and ponder to ourselves questions revolving around the idea of death itself. For example, what would happen to me when I die? Is there such a thing called an afterlife? Or is that something to comfort us in our final days? What will happen to my family or my friends after I'm gone? Will they truly miss me or remember me? How will they cope after I'm gone? We ask ourselves so many questions like these because it's that fear of the unknown, that fear of not knowing what comes next. Then you have losing someone that can impact us, both physically and emotionally. In this episode, however, we will only be talking about the latter half. Hopefully, later down in the line, we can come back to the topic and talk about the fear of death and why are we so afraid of it. But for right now, let's talk about how someone's death can impact us. As previously mentioned, someone's passing can affect us both physically and emotionally or psychologically. Now, you may ask me, Julian, how does death affect us physically? Well, obviously, someone will point out the fact that, of course, death is going to affect us physically. After all, we're dead. We're not breathing or moving anymore. And while, yes, that is true, when I say it can affect us physically, I'm referring to carrying out and executing someone's wishes, whether it's planning for the burial or putting their affairs in order. This is called physical preparation. Normally, we are prepared for this, especially when our loved ones gave us instructions in their will on how they wish for things to happen once they die. However, we have this thing called emotional preparation. With that, we are always unprepared. Despite knowing that the end was coming for your loved one, you are not emotionally ready for when that time has to come, when you have to handle that when they're gone. With this type of preparation, we feel like we do not have the necessary instructions to help guide us and process, as well as to recover from a death in your family or a friend group. This can impact you severely because when we lose that person we once cherished for so long in our lives, whether a family member, a friend, a spouse, a partner, or someone we were just very close to, we tend not to have the guide or series of instructions and information on how to cope and to properly grieve and move on. The loss of a loved one can take us down a harmful spiral, which can be the other type of loss, other than the loss of your loved one. With that, you tend to be lonely and confused. Where do you go next without this person? It's that feeling of the unknown that puts you in a bind, in which I like to call the unknown bind or the unknown spiral. That is because we tend to put ourselves in a downward path of the unknown. We begin to feel empty inside because that void has entered when that person has left. Sometimes we take negative or destructive ways in our lives in order to solve this great sadness and to fill the empty void that was made after that person died. Some of these things can be like depression, for example. We are so comfortable and used to having that person be with us and being present in our lives that when it's time for them to go, it becomes hard to really move on. After all, that bond you had with that person, both physically and emotionally, has now vanished, making you feel like you have no one to reach out to, making you feel consumed by that void of loneliness when walking through that unknown spiral. Sometimes we take drastic measures and we may impose self-harm or harm on others like bullying, to even go as far as killing ourselves. This is because somehow that person was important to our lives in a way that kept us stable and at ease. Now, since that they're dead, it's impossible for us to live on without them. How can I continue my life without this person? We use these things like self-harm, bullying, or suicide as a means of coping or a way to deal with the loss. However, this not only can hurt other people, both physically and emotionally, this can also hurt yourself, whether you inflict the pain onto others or when you inflict the pain on yourself. The death of a loved one can also make us lose motivation in doing things, especially doing the things we've once loved. Whether it's a hobby like writing or going outside and playing, maybe that hobby involved that person, and it just doesn't feel the same without their presence, especially when their absence is eternal. We begin to think that just like their absence, the pain that we feel and that we have will also be eternal and everlasting, that we can never get over the loss of the one person you loved, the one person that you were so fond of and you speak about, the one person that brought you joy in life when you heard from them or when you seen their face. It could be a friend, a family member, a partner. Having them exit our lives and feeling like we cannot mend the void that was left behind when they died is a natural feeling. Thinking that methods like self-harm or suicide is the best answer to cope or to solve this issue of yours is a natural thought too. However, those thoughts of suicide and self-harm are unhealthy to fathom. It puts our physical, our psychological, our emotional health in harm's way. What I mean by this is that you have two separate things. You have people who know that their time is coming and they either want to get closure from others or they want to grant others that sense of closure from themselves. They want to give that person closure. You also have the other perspective of this matter, where people who are aware that a loved one is dying and since their time on earth is limited, those people have a chance to talk to them and to receive closure from them before they die. However, in this case, we will be focusing on the second perspective. One group we tend to forget and ignore sometimes when talking about timing and closure is when people die unexpectedly. I'm sure a perfect example of this is when we hear the death of a celebrity when they died so young. Celebrities like Tupac or Selena, Paul Walker, Mac Miller, or Michael Jackson. When we heard that they have died, we were shocked and even mortified. We may ask many questions, but the big two we as people tend to ask are, how did they die and how old were they when they died? In fact, this applies to everyone, including regular people like you and me. When you hear the news that someone you know personally has died, those are the two prominent questions you have. Then, when you hear that they died at such a young age, like 3 years old, or 5 years old, 10 years old, or 20, 27, or in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, and so on, you become mortified. How could they die at such a young age? It's just so unexpected. You are so alarmed and pulled aback that something like death could happen to someone you know at such a young age, especially someone you knew. You see, when someone who was very close to you, when they unexpectedly die, we begin to feel that sense of guilt for not doing so sooner, for not just ourselves, but for that person. Other emotions will burn alongside with that feeling of resentment and guilt, such as anger. We are so angry at ourselves in our inaction to do anything before that person died. If anything, with this array of emotions, it makes it hard for one to forgive themselves, to really give themselves the proper ability to grieve for their loved ones, to properly move on. Since you deprive that person of any closure in their final moments, you permit yourself to be deprived of self-closure and refuse to forgive yourself, using their death as justification to do so. In fact, this actually ties to not just my story, but the inspiration for the episode, my grandfather. You see, back in 2014, my grandfather was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer when I was around 8 years old and when I was in elementary school. Now, typically, with the later stages of pancreatic cancer, you're only given a few months to at least a year and a half. However, me and my family were lucky and we were able to spend an additional 3 years with him. When it was coming closer and closer to my grandfather having to leave me and my family, my father would sit me down and he would tell me to make sure I spend more time with him before he passes away. As much as I wanted to spend time with my grandfather in his final moments, I was just so busy and caught up in trying to get my work done for school. I never really had my grandfather on my mind as my main priority. It was first my schoolwork, then my family. During that whole time, my dad would constantly be telling me to make sure I call my grandfather and talk to him before he died. However, I never truly put that time into really talking to my grandfather because I was so focused on getting my work done, to make sure my grades were good and my parents were happy with the fact that I was working hard to achieve those grades. And on February 20th, 2017, my grandfather died. The word devastated wasn't even enough to describe the heartbreak I felt when I heard the news. The news about the man who always took me fishing and watched cops with me and spent my holidays, the fact that now he's gone. I knew he was dying and all, but I still wasn't prepared to hear that type of news. My heart was aching, and when I heard the news about my grandfather passing away, my mom told me to see it as a positive thing that he died. Not because of the fact that he died, but because of the fact that he's not in pain anymore and he's not suffering anymore, where he can finally be at peace. And by the time his funeral came by, I was happy. I was happy he was in a better place, but deep down inside, I was just seething with resentment and anger towards nobody but myself. I hated myself for so long. It was my fault. It was all my fault. It was all my fault. It was all me. It was my fault that I didn't spend more time with him. I just felt that everything was my fault for not getting the needed and proper closure for myself or for him as my grandfather. And now, because of the fact that my grandfather is dead, I can never really get that opportunity again. That caused me to have more resentment towards myself and being unable and unwilling even to forgive myself. It took as recent as last year to come to terms with the fact that it wasn't my fault and that I need to forgive myself. To finally let go of that balloon of self-resentment and have it fly away from not just me, but from my life. Not only that, but after he died, I became more depressed and isolated from people. I was more focused on mending the hole left in my heart from his passing than anything else. Letting go all of that pent-up guilt and resentment towards myself about my grandfather and his passing, it kind of made me feel like I was granting myself closure. I called it self-made closure. It was where it replaces the idea of closure I should have gotten from my grandfather in his last moments alive, to where I fill it in with all the memories we had as grandfather and grandson. With that, and knowing that he's watching over me and he sees the accomplishments I've made, that I've done throughout my life without him being here physically, it gave me not only closure from my grandfather, but also gave me inner peace. Because in reality, the memories we make with people when they're alive is sometimes all the closure you really need when they're finally gone. It's knowing that they are still present in your life by being in your heart, being in your memories, and having the idea that they are watching over you in spirit, it provides not just that needed closure, but that essential inner peace. That inner peace and closure that's been vacant for so long, and to seal the void that was once made. Not only that, I knew that my grandfather wouldn't want to see me focus all my time on his death and distract myself from maintaining my grades at the time. So instead of allowing myself to use his passing as some sort of excuse for me to fail my classes and slip behind my academics and my achievements, I used his passing as a reason for me to keep motivated, while also allowing myself that needed time to grieve. Now, before I start bawling my eyes out on this podcast, let's talk about how we can recover from a loss and avoid negative things to remain positive. And with that, to me, the best solution to recover from loss is to allow yourself to grieve peacefully. While doing this, take the time to also remember all the positive things they gave you, not just all the materialistic things like gifts or what they've left you after they died, but mostly, if not completely, all the happy and positive memories they gave you. Cherish and hold on to those memories while you go through such a difficult time in your life, like this, like their passing. It's also good to talk to someone you trust and can help you go through with this challenging moment in your life, whether it's a good friend, a family member, or a professional therapist. Another thing, or another question someone may think about is, how can I get that closure from my loved one or friend before they die? With this, I suggest that you should designate some time to your friend or your loved one. Make that time you have left with that person. Make it fun. Make it special. Make it something meaningful. That way, you can get some level of closure while also having the time to spend before they pass away and it's too late. As for those who are facing an unexpected death and were robbed of the opportunity to get that closure, think about all the beautiful memories you and that person made with each other. Let go of that feeling of guilt, that pressure of guilt, and allow yourself to grieve properly while still coping by using those memories. Find something to do to bring you to a better point mentally and emotionally after their passing. However, in both unexpected and expected deaths, the best thing you should do is always find someone you trust and talk to them, to allow your emotions to not just be conveyed in a healthy way, but for them to be heard by someone, especially someone who cares about you, even after a tragedy like this, the tragedy of losing your loved one. Also, one last thing. I know times can be tough, especially when you lose someone that is very close to you. You may feel lonely when that person is vacant from this mortal plane. If you feel like that, if you feel like you can't go on without that person, I'm sure you can, my friend. You may not see that now, but it takes time. You have to allow yourself that time to heal from your emotional scars and wounds. My friend, you are worthy. You matter in this world. You bring value to this world, and you are loved by people. Your presence brings so much joy to people, and you may not know it. Please don't hurt yourself. I'm sure your loved one wouldn't want you to hurt yourself, to kill yourself. If anything, they'd want you to be strong, because even though they're gone, they will always still love you. You may not feel it physically or hear them say it vocally, but deep down, know that they are and will always watch over you. They will always be proud of you. They will always protect you. They will always love you. If you have any suicidal ideations, please do not be afraid to get the help you need. You are strong, and getting help isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of progress and growth. It's a sign of strength. The Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is 988. The services are free, and it's open 24/7 for you if you're in need, or you're planning to kill yourself, or you're harming yourself. Please remember, you are worthy. You have value. Life may not be perfect, but it can be beautiful if you just try and make it beautiful. Even on the rainiest of days in our lives, we can still make that day a beautiful day. And that can easily happen by waking up to see the next sunshine, to see the next sunset. And frankly, I want your candle to keep burning, even when it rains. So please, if you ever feel like your life is pointless, or you don't want to live anymore, especially after the death of a loved one or a friend, I encourage you to keep your candle of life burning as bright as ever through these dark endeavors, and call that number, my friend, 988. Remember, you matter in this world. You are worthy, and I know that you can get over this emotional hurdle. Don't let yourself or others deter you from getting the help you need, to tell you otherwise. Before I end this episode, I like to give you a quote. Sadly, I couldn't find the person who said this quote, but it goes like this: we never truly get over a loss, but we can always move forward and evolve from it. When I read this quote, I think it means that even though we say that we're going to get over the loss of a loved one, we can never truly do that. We can never truly get over the loss of someone we loved. The death of someone we love can have an impacting and lasting memory on us for the rest of our lives. However, we as people are given the opportunity to not just reflect, but to also learn and to grow from the loss, to keep pushing ahead during such times of grief and sorrow, where we can get to a point where we accept the fact that the person is no longer with us, but they can never be forgotten by us. Well, my friend, you have reached the end of this lovely discussion. To ensure you are in the right headspace and to continue to follow the path of progress, to better equip yourself with the sage wisdom to help guide you on your journey we call life. If you wish to continue our weekly talks on how to become a better version of yourself, my suggestion is to press the follow or subscribe button wherever you're listening to this podcast. If you feel like someone could be in need to hear these words and to steer them to the path of progress and to feel empowered, informed, and inspired, why not share this podcast and its teachings to them? Until next time on your journey, my friend, keep the candle burning.
Thank you for listening to Enlightenment with Julian Nicholas. We hope today's episode has sparked new insights and empowered you on your path to personal growth. For more inspiration and wisdom, be sure to subscribe and follow. Connect with Julian on Instagram at enlightenment_pod. And if you found value in the show, please tell someone else. Join Julian next time as he continues his journey towards enlightenment. Until then, remember to embrace your journey and live your best life.